The sound of a spade hitting the earth is usually a sound of creation, a rhythmic promise of life that I have loved for 50 years. It signifies the planting of a bulb, the turning of soil for a new season, the bedding of a rose that will bloom when the frost retreats. But on that humid Tuesday morning, the sound of metal slicing into dirt didn't sound like life. It sounded like a death knell. It sounded like the final nail being hammered into the coffin of everything I had built. My name is Arthur Peneligan, 81 years old, a retired botanist who knows more about the complex root systems of hydrangeas than I do about the cruel mechanics of the modern world. For half a century, this Victorian farmhouse and its acre of English gardens were my sanctuary. It was where my wife, Eleanor, and I raised our daughter, Jessica. It was where Eleanor breathed her last, sitting on the teak bench under the weeping willow, her hand in mine, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of violet and gold. But now, the sanctuary was under siege, and the enemy wasn't a blight or a frost. It was my own flesh and blood. Jessica stood on the wraparound porch, her arms crossed over a blazer that cost more than my first car. Next to her stood a realtor, a man with teeth too white and a suit too shiny, who was pointing at my prize-winning azaleas as if they were nothing more than weeds to be sprayed with poison. I stood by the trellis, gripping my cane until my knuckles turned white, listening to them dissect my life. "The developer wants the lot cleared completely, Dad," Jessica called out, her voice projecting over the garden with a tone devoid of sentiment. "They're building luxury condos, high density. The farmhouse is a teardown." "There is no rot in this house, Jessica," I said, my voice shaking, not from age, but from a rage I was struggling to suppress. "I replaced the siding 5 years ago." She walked down the steps, her heels sinking into the soft turf I had aerated myself. She looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap. "It's over, Dad," she said, pulling a folded document from her purse. "We've discussed this. You can't manage this place alone. You're forgetting things. You left the hose on last week." "I left the hose on because I was answering the phone when you called to ask for money," I snapped. She ignored me, turning to the realtor. "Once we close, maybe 2 weeks," the realtor said, looking at his watch.
"But we need the property vacant by Friday," I choked out. "This is Tuesday." Jessica sighed, a sound of supreme inconvenience. "That's why I hired the movers, Dad. You don't have to pack. They'll box up the essentials, your clothes, your toiletries, a few photos. The rest, well, the estate sale people will handle the rest on Saturday. You're moving to Shady Pines on Friday morning." Shady Pines, the warehouse for the unwanted. A place that smelled of antiseptic and boiled cabbage, where they parked old men in front of televisions and waited for them to stop breathing. "I am not going to memory care," I said, standing as tall as my curved spine would allow. "You signed the power of attorney 3 years ago, Arthur," she said, using my first name, a weaponized intimacy. "When you had the stroke. You trusted me to make these decisions when you couldn't." I stood there, feeling the vibration of her betrayal in my bones. She wasn't just selling a house, she was selling my memories. She was selling the spot where Eleanor planted the first tulip. She was selling the oak tree where Jessica's own swing used to hang. That power of attorney was a document I signed in a moment of fear, trusting her implicitly because she was my daughter. That trust was a mistake. She had slowly drained my savings account for my care, upgrading her car and her wardrobe while I lived on oatmeal and tea, and now she wanted the equity in the land. I was an obstacle, a piece of old furniture to be moved to a storage unit. If you have ever looked into the eyes of the child you rocked to sleep, the child you sacrificed everything for, and saw only a calculator assessing your net worth, hit that subscribe button. Because looking at Jessica, I realized she didn't see a father, she saw a liquidity event, and I wasn't going to let her bulldoze Eleanor's garden without a fight. The fallout was silent and suffocating. Jessica left with the realtor to sign papers at his office, leaving me alone in the kingdom she was about to destroy. I spent the next 2 days in a fugue of grief. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I wandered the garden at night, the moonlight turning the roses into silver ghosts.
It was during one of these sleepless wanderings, around 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, that the plan took root. I was sitting on the bench under the willow, shivering in my robe, staring at the old potting shed. I remembered the heavy iron strongbox I kept in there, buried under sacks of fertilizer.
It was a relic from my father, a sturdy thing made of cast iron that weighed 50 pounds even when empty. And I remembered Jessica's fatal flaw. It wasn't just greed, it was arrogance. She believed I was a senile old fool who mumbled to himself. She believed she was the smartest person in the room, and she believed money was the only god worth worshiping. If I couldn't stop her with the law, that power of attorney was airtight. I had to stop her with her own nature. I needed an ally. I waited until the sun rose and walked 3 miles to the town center, leaving my phone behind so she couldn't track me. I went to the diner where Henry held court every morning. Henry was my oldest friend, a man I had known since we were privates in the Army. He was also a retired forensic accountant who had spent 30 years chasing tax evaders. I slid into the booth opposite him. He looked up from his crossword puzzle, his eyes narrowing. "You look like you're going to a funeral, Artie," Henry said. "I am," I whispered. "Mine." We whispered over coffee like conspirators plotting a coup. I told him everything. The sale, Shady Pines, the demolition. Henry listened, his jaw tightening, his eyes losing their warmth. "That girl always was a shark," Henry grumbled. "I need to buy my house," I said, "but I can't be the buyer." I laid out the plan. It involved the last secret stash of savings bonds I had hidden in a safe deposit box 20 years ago, money Jessica didn't know existed because it predated the digital records she monitored. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a down payment if the price was low. "Greenleaf Holdings," Henry mused, tapping his pen on the table. "I can set up the shell corporation by noon. I still have contacts in Delaware. I can act as the proxy. But Artie, why would she sell to us for a lowball offer?" "Because," I said, a cold smile touching my lips for the first time in weeks, "she's going to think the real value isn't in the land." Henry looked at me, confusion clouding his face, until I explained the rest. His eyes began to twinkle. "It's risky, Artie," he said. "She won't," I said. "She thinks I'm losing my mind." That night, the theater began. Jessica was staying in the guest room to supervise the packing, which meant she sat on her laptop while hired movers threw my books into boxes with careless abandon. At midnight, I saw the light under her door. She was awake. I went out to the garden.
I carried an old kerosene lantern, the flame flickering in the wind, casting long, dancing shadows against the house. I carry a shovel. I moved slowly, theatrically, dragging my left leg a little more than necessary. I went to the rose garden, specifically to the bed of peace roses Eleanor had planted for our 40th anniversary. They were directly in the line of sight of the guest room window. I set the lantern down. I started to dig. The soil was soft, thank God. I dug a hole 3 feet deep. My back screamed in protest, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I kept going. Once the hole was ready, I went to the shed. I dragged out the iron strongbox. I had spent the afternoon filling it, not with gold, not with silver. I had filled it with old lead fishing weights I hadn't used in decades, rusty bolts, and a few bricks wrapped in rags to stop them from clanking. It weighed nearly 60 pounds. I dragged it across the gravel path. The sound was loud, a harsh, grinding scrape that cut through the silence of the night. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I stopped by the hole. I looked up at the house. I muttered to myself, pitching my voice just loud enough to carry through the open window where the curtain fluttered. "They'll never find it," I whispered hoarsely, sounding maniac. "The family fortune stays here, safe with Eleanor. No banks, no daughters." I pushed the box into the hole. It hit the bottom with a heavy metallic thud that sounded like a vault door closing. "Safe," I muttered again, patting the dirt back over it. "Millions." I saw the curtain twitch. It was subtle, just a slight movement against the light, but I saw it. I saw her silhouette frozen against the glass. She was watching. She had seen the box. I finished burying it. I smoothed the dirt over.
I scattered some mulch to make it look disturbed but hidden. Then I picked up my lantern and shuffled back to the house, humming a tune Eleanor used to love. The seed was planted. Now I just had to wait for the greed to water it. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. It was palpable. Jessica was no longer rushing to get me out the door. She was hovering. She made me breakfast, eggs and toast, something she hadn't done in years. She watched me eat, her eyes darting constantly to the window that overlooked the rose garden. "How did you sleep?" she asked, pouring me coffee. "Like a baby," I lied. "Dreamt of your mother. We were rich in the dream." She stiffened. "Rich?"
At 10 a.m., the realtor arrived with the contract for the condo developers. Jessica met him on the porch. I stayed in the kitchen, listening through the screen door. "We need to wait," Jessica said, her voice tight. The realtor sounded annoyed. "Jessica, the offer expires tomorrow." I think we can get a better deal," she said. "I want to look at other options, cash buyers who can close immediately." "Cash buyers won't pay what the developer is paying," the realtor argued. "I don't care," she snapped. "I want a quick close, today or tomorrow, and I want to keep possession of the property for 48 hours after closing to—" "That's highly irregular," the realtor said. "I can't recommend—" "You're fired," she said coldly. She came back inside, her face flushed with adrenaline. She pulled out her phone and started making calls. She was trying to find a way to sell the land fast, get the liquidity, and buy herself time to dig up the box before the new owners took over. She wanted to double dip. She wanted the sale price of the house and the buried treasure she imagined was worth millions. She didn't know she was playing right into Henry's hands. At noon, her phone rang. It was Henry, posing as the representative for Greenleaf Holdings. I sat in my armchair, pretending to read a book, watching her pace the living room. "Yes," she said into the phone. "Yes, it's a Victorian. Prime lot. We need a cash deal. Fast closing." She listened. "The price? Well, the developer offered—" "Oh." She bit her lip, looking out the window at the rose garden. She did the math in her head. If she sold to the developer, she had to wait weeks for closing, and they would bring in bulldozers that might uncover the box before she could get to it. If she sold to this Greenleaf Holdings for half the price, she got the money instantly, kept access to the property for 2 days, and could dig up the millions tonight. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "We accept." She hung up and turned to me, a predatory smile plastered on her face. "Good news, Dad," she said. "I found a buyer, a private investment firm." I asked, widening my eyes. "Yes, but they need to close immediately, tomorrow morning." She put the papers in front of me an hour later. They were emailed from Henry's secure server. "It's a great deal, Dad," she lied, her hand shaking slightly as she handed me the pen. "They want to close in 48 hours. I looked at the document. Greenleaf Holdings. The purchase price was laughable, pennies on the dollar for a property of this size. But she didn't care about the house price anymore. She was blinded by the lure of the buried box. She thought she was scamming a faceless corporation and her senile father. She didn't know she was selling my house back to me, using her own greed to drive the price down to exactly what my hidden bonds could cover. I asked, feigning hesitation. "It's perfect, Dad," she urged, pressing the pen into my hand. "Sign it. For me." I looked at her. I saw the desperation. I saw the avarice. "Okay, sweetheart," I said. I signed the papers with a shaky hand, hiding the smirk that threatened to break through my mask of senility. I signed away the house to myself. "There," she said, snatching the papers away. "Done. Now why don't you go take a nap?" "I think I will," I said, standing up. I walked to my room, listening to her scramble to scan the documents. She was already planning her night. She was going to wait for darkness. She was going to dig up the roses. I sat on my bed and looked at the photo of Eleanor on the nightstand. "She took the bait, Elle," I whispered. The house was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath. The storm was coming, and Jessica Penelagon was about to get soaking wet. The night before the closing was thick with a tension so physical I could taste it on the back of my tongue, metallic and sour like an old penny. The air inside the farmhouse was heavy, charged with the static electricity of impending storms, both the meteorological low-pressure system rolling in from the coast and the emotional hurricane brewing in my daughter's heart.
I sat in my armchair in the living room, a book open on my lap that I hadn't read a single line of. Jessica was pacing. Back and forth she went, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors like the ticking of a countdown timer. She checked her watch. She checked the window. She checked her phone. She offered me tea with a sweetness that tasted like saccharin, a cloying performance of the dutiful daughter that made my stomach turn. "Here you go, Dad," she said, placing the mug on the coaster. "Chamomile. It'll help you sleep. You have a big day tomorrow." "Yes," I said, my voice deliberately thin and wavering. "Moving day. It feels fast, Jessica." She sighed, a sound of supreme patience masking deep irritation. "We've been over this."
The buyers are cash investors. They want the keys at noon. She needed me asleep. She needed the darkness. She needed the house to be a tomb so she could rob the grave she thought I had dug. I played my part. At 8 p.m., I announced I was exhausted. I shuffled down the hallway, leaning heavily on my cane, letting my feet drag. I went into my bedroom and closed the door. I turned off the light, but I didn't get into bed. I pulled the straight-back chair to the window, parting the lace curtains just a fraction of an inch. I sat there in the dark, watching the garden stage I had set. The moon was obscured by clouds, but the ambient light from the street lamps cast a gray, ghostly pallor over the yard. I waited. Time stretches when you are waiting for a betrayal to happen. Minutes felt like hours. I listened to the house settle, the old timbers groaning as they cooled. I heard Jessica moving in the kitchen. I heard the back door unlock. At midnight, the latch clicked. The door creaked open, and Jessica emerged. She was dressed in black, leggings and a hoodie, looking ridiculous, like a caricature of a cat burglar from a bad movie. She was carrying a shovel she had taken from the shed. She stumbled over the uneven pavers of the patio, cursing softly under her breath. She didn't look at the garden with love. She looked at it with hunger. She went straight to the rose bushes. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful, erratic rhythm. I watched as she raised the shovel and brought it down on the peace roses. Thud. Crack. She hacked at the roots. She tore at the branches. She was destroying Eleanor's favorite flowers with a frenzy that was terrifying to behold. It wasn't just digging. It was an exorcism of her own guilt, a frantic need to get to the prize before her conscience or her father woke up. She dug like a woman possessed, sweat glistening on her forehead in the faint light. She threw dirt over her shoulder, oblivious to the destruction she was causing. She was tearing apart the legacy of this house to find a shortcut to a life she hadn't earned. Then, the shovel hit metal. Clang. It was a dull, heavy sound, muffled by the earth, but to her, it must have sounded like a choir of angels. I heard her gasp, a sharp intake of breath that carried up to my window. "Yes," she hissed. She dropped to her knees in the mud. She clawed dirt with her bare hands, heedless of the thorns or the cold. She gripped the handle of the iron strongbox and pulled.
It didn't budge. I had filled it with 60 pounds of lead fishing weights and rusty bolts. It was dead weight. She groaned, bracing her feet against the edge of the hole. She heaved, her face contorted with effort. Slowly, agonizingly, she hauled the box out of its grave. It landed on the grass with a heavy thud. She sat back on her heels, panting. I held my breath. If she opened it now, the game was up. If she opened it now, the confrontation would happen in the dark, and I needed the light of day. I needed witnesses. She reached for the latch. Then she stopped. A car drove by on the main road, its headlights sweeping across the lawn. She froze, crouching over the box like a gargoyle. Paranoid, she was terrified of being seen. She stood up, wiping her muddy hands on her pants. She grabbed the handle of the box and began to drag it. She didn't open it. She was too smart for that, or so she thought. She was going to secure the asset first. She dragged it across the lawn, the metal scraping through the grass, leaving a trail of ruined turf. She hauled it to the driveway, to the trunk of her luxury SUV. It took her 3 tries to lift it over the bumper. When she finally slammed the trunk shut, she leaned against the car, laughing quietly. It was a manic, breathless sound. She thought she had won. She thought she had the house money secured for tomorrow and the family fortune in her trunk tonight. She walked back into the house,
leaving the hole gaping open like a wound in the earth. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the hole, mourning the roses, and waiting for the sun to rise on the harvest of fools. The next morning, the atmosphere in the kitchen was brittle. Jessica was vibrating with adrenaline. She had showered, but she hadn't scrubbed hard enough. There was still a rim of dirt under her fingernails. At 9 a.m., the notary arrived. It wasn't just any notary. It was a woman named Brenda, hired specifically by Henry for this purpose. She was efficient, brisk, and entirely professional. We sat at the kitchen table. The contract for the sale of the property to Greenleaf Holdings sat in the center. "All right," Brenda said, laying out the documents. "This is a cash transaction, immediate transfer of title. The purchase price is set at $250,000. It was less than half of what the developer had offered. It was a robbery, but Jessica nodded vigorously. "Yes, that's correct," she said, tapping the table.
We just want a quick close. I see, Brenda said, pushing the deed toward me. Mr. Jessica practically pushed the pen into my hand. Her eyes were darting to the driveway, where her car sat heavy with its secret cargo. "It's for the best, Dad," she urged, her voice tight. "Sign it. You'll be safer at the home. No more stairs." I looked at her. I looked at the daughter who used to make mud pies in the very garden she had desecrated last night. I saw no love in her eyes. I saw only the reflection of her own reflection. "You're right, Jessica," I said, my voice steady. I signed. I signed my name with a flourish, handing over the title of my life's work to the shell company my best friend controlled. "And you, Miss Penhaligon," Brenda said. Jessica signed so fast she nearly tore the paper. "The wire transfer has been initiated," Brenda said, checking her tablet. "It should hit the account in... there." Jessica let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days. She stood up immediately. "Great, wonderful, thank you," she said, ushering Brenda toward the door. "Dad, the movers will be here in an hour for your clothes. I just need to get my last few boxes from the car and head to the bank to..." She was running. She had the money from the house, and now she wanted to get away with the box before anyone noticed the hole in the yard. "I'll walk you out," I said, grabbing my cane. "No, stay here, rest," she snapped. "I want to smell the air, Jessica," I said, ignoring her and pushing past her onto the porch. I walked down the steps. Jessica was already at her car. She popped the trunk. She couldn't wait. She couldn't drive away without looking. The greed was an itch she had to scratch. Just as the trunk lid rose, a beige sedan pulled into the driveway, blocking her exit. It was Henry. He stepped out, wearing a suit I hadn't seen him wear since his wife's funeral. He held a thick folder in his hand. "Henry?" Jessica demanded, shielding the trunk with her body. "Hello, Jessica," Henry said calmly. She looked confused. "Dad's friend? What do you want?" "I know," Henry said. Jessica froze. "But that's not why I'm here," Henry continued, walking closer. Jessica ignored him. She turned back to the trunk. She needed to see the gold. She needed the reassurance that she had won. She pried the latch of the strongbox open with a screwdriver she pulled from her pocket, her hands trembling violently. "Henry!" she shouted over her shoulder.
"Open it, Jessica," I said from the porch. My voice was no longer the wavering whisper of an old man. It was the voice of a father who was done. She threw the lid back. The sun hit the contents of the box. There was no gold. There were no bonds. There were no stacks of cash. There was a pile of dull, gray lead fishing weights. There were rusty bolts. There were 3 old bricks wrapped in rags. And sitting on top, pristine and white, was a single laminated sheet of paper. I watched the color drain from her face. It washed away instantly, leaving her skin the shade of dead ash. She made a sound, a choked, strangled whimper. She reached in and picked up the paper. "Read it," I commanded. She stared at the paper, her eyes scanning the words I had written 3 nights ago. "My dearest Jessica," she read, her voice barely a whisper. She stopped. She looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. "Keep reading," Henry said sternly. "The house now belongs to Greenleaf Holdings," she read, her voice cracking, tears of rage and confusion spilling over. "A trust managed by Henry for my benefit. You sold my home back to me for half its value. The proceeds you just received will barely cover the capital gains tax and the legal fees I'm charging you for the destruction of my garden. Please leave my property." She dropped the paper. It fluttered into the box of rusty bolts. "You!" she shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat. You tricked me! You senile old bastard! There was gold! I heard you!" "You heard what you wanted to hear," I said, walking down the steps, my cane hitting the pavement with a solid, authoritative rhythm. "You saw what your greed allowed you to see.
You looked at a box of junk and saw millions because that's all you see in anything, Jessica. Value. I pointed to the garden. You destroyed the roses, Jessica. Eleanor's roses. That is what unforgivable looks like. But roots grow back. She looked at the house. She looked at Henry. She looked at the deed in Henry's hand. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had sold the asset she controlled for a fraction of its worth to the very man she was trying to rob, all to chase a phantom fortune. "You!" she screamed, lunging toward me. "I'll sue you!" Henry stepped between us, solid as a rock. "Actually, Jessica," Henry said, opening his folder, "that power of attorney was contingent on your father's incapacitation. We have a certification from Dr.
Evans, dated yesterday, confirming Arthur is of sound mind." Henry pointed up to the branches. Jessica followed his finger. A small black lens stared back at her. "The police are on their way," Henry said, checking his watch. "They are coming to take a report regarding the theft of the gold, which turned out to be scrap metal, and the vandalism of the garden. We can press charges for elder abuse and attempted theft. Or you can leave now. You can return the wire transfer to the trust immediately to avoid fraud charges." Jessica looked at the empty driveway. She looked at the box of lead. She looked at me. She whimpered, playing her last card, the victim card. I have debts. The developer." "That sounds like a you problem," I said coldly. She collapsed. It wasn't a graceful fall. She simply crumbled against the bumper of her luxury SUV, sliding down until she hit the asphalt. She sobbed into her hands, a jagged, ugly sound. She wept not for the loss of her father, but for the loss of the money. She had lost the house, she had lost the fortune, and she had lost the father she had underestimated. "Go," I said. She scrambled up, wiping her face, smearing mascara across her cheeks. She threw the screwdriver into the trunk and slammed it shut on the box of bolts. She got into the driver's seat, revving the engine aggressively. She peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind her, speeding away from the ruin she had created. Later that evening, the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. I sat on the porch swing with Henry. We had a bottle of whiskey between us. The garden was a mess. There were holes dug everywhere. The peace roses were trampled and broken, their limbs scattered in the mud. It would take years to fix. But the house was mine. The deed was in the trust, safe from her, safe from developers. I sipped my whiskey, feeling the burn in my chest. I looked at the ravaged rosebush. It was damaged, yes, but deep down beneath the scarred earth, the root ball was still alive. "She's gone, Artie," Henry said quietly. "Yes," I said. I would replant. I would prune the damage. I would water the soil. And for the first time in 3 years, I would sleep in my own house with one eye open. The gold was never in the ground. It was right here, in the peace of knowing the weeds had finally been pulled.